very much for coming along tonight. On behalf of Alba Aberdeen, a big welcome to you all. I'm actually the organiser, and there's a campaign on just now. And part of that campaign, because with Alba, the first and foremost thing is independence. And we'll be hearing from our wonderful Charlie and our wonderful Alex later. We do have a wee raffle going on, and we're going to have an auction, and also after the tragic events in Syria, there's a way to donate should you wish. But as I was driving here tonight, I thought I'd listen to the Corries to get me in the mood, and which song came on, but well, wouldn't affect for Charlie. And the next line is, who would now raise their sword? I would say it's not a sword we raise in the campaign, but we do chap a lot of doors. So he's a fantastic guy. He's a local traditional musician, very, very committed to independence and the local area. So without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Charlie.
Testing, 1, 2, it's working. Well, I'm not used to using radio mics, I normally have one in front. See if we got on with it. First, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my heartfelt condolences to Abel Mackenzie and our family. It must be a difficult time for them. And that's why there's by-elections here. But anyway, we are where we are, and I'm standing for Alba. And why I'm standing for Alba is because Alba, to me, are the best party that represent the views where I find myself. And they're the only party that put independence as an immediate priority. And after years of being in the SNP, I think the best part of the SNP is went to Alba. And Alba are the people. Is this thing working, or will I just get rid of it?
Use it like a mic.
Can I use a normal mic? 2 seconds. I prefer a normal. Use that. This is the one I normally use. There we go. That's better. Number 7. With the desk to go if you want. Right, so Alba have got the activists, and they've got the experience, and they've got the policies that I really like, policies that are common sense, policies that are for the people. And they've got the best strategists, they've got the best politicians, and they speak to me and what I believe in. And this is a local election. I can't do anything about independence, really, but everything starts from a local place. The whole politics is local, and it all works up towards something else. So this is about independence in a way, although it's a local election. We've already got 2 SNP politicians here in the council in this ward. We've got 2 SNP, we've got a Labour. We don't have an Alba. And if you're an SNP voter, I would like you to vote number 1 for me. And then you can vote who you want in your second one. Because if you're wanting independence, you'll be sending a message to the SNP that you want independence. And by giving me a vote, that will move the dial towards independence. That's important. In our local area, there's a lot of things that I notice and things I've discovered on the door as well. People are telling me about stuff all the time. But the obvious thing is fuel poverty. In a ward that we live in, it's got to be one of the most energy-rich wards in the whole of the United Kingdom, perhaps. We've got BP, we've got the busiest helipad in the world, we've got the airport, there's countless energy companies. But one other thing we have is food banks, and we have warm banks. We've got 4 warm banks, or warm spaces they call them. Now, if you're not ashamed of that, there's something wrong with you. There is no excuse for an energy-rich city or an energy-rich country to be having food banks or warm banks or poverty. That's something that every Scottish person should be ashamed of. And if you're not standing up and screaming for independence and screaming for something to be done about that, you need to have a deep look inside yourself. And if you're a unionist, please explain your case for the union, because you've had 300 years to get it right, and it's still not right for us. So, locally, one of the big mistakes that disagreements I have is the men's sheds. The men's sheds have had their funding withdrawn. I believe it's 75 grand a year. I think I'm led to believe there's about 200 men's sheds across Scotland. All the people that work in the men's sheds are volunteers. So there's not a lot of cost in this for the massive amount they do in the society. And to take that funding away, where we live in a country where the young men and middle-aged men have the highest suicide rate in Europe, the men's sheds do an incredible job helping men get on and find peace and communicate with each other. It's a brilliant thing. To take that away and at the same time be happy to spend 2 million on gender stuff, charities that are getting favours from the Scottish Government seems to me to be absolutely scandalous. 2 million for a tiny bit of the population, or 75 grand to help all these men who have got very little else to help them in society, let's face it. But it's a great thing. And Union Street, our oil capital of Europe, Union Street's a mess. Everybody agrees. Does anybody say, oh, what a wonderful city centre Aberdeen is? Last 20 years, it's looking so good. No, it's not. It's a mess. What's happened to it? There's about 160 odd units in Union Street, and 114 of them are empty. How can you have 114 empty streets in Union Street? You need to open it up, get traffic going, get people coming back into the town centre. We need creative thinking, something that's been lacking in the council. That needs to be addressed. And the buses, I mean, bus gates everywhere. Well, we need the buses. Well, that would be great. But there's no bus service to the beach ballroom. I speak to old people, because I'm a musician, and I know they come out of the beach ballroom. Again, they go to a tea dance in the afternoon. It's January, nobody's got their tea dances because they can't get a bus. And that's just, right. A bus route should serve the flagship venue of the council. That makes sense. And other thing is the ice everywhere. We've had ice and we've had nae gritters. Many people in the doors that we've spoke to have been injured, fallen in the ice. Alec and I were both at the doors, and we met people that hadn't left the house for ages. There was a woman who broke her pelvis because she slipped in the ice. Older folk can't get out and do their shopping. And in the A&E, in December, the injuries in the A&E went up 90% through people falling in the ice. And in January, with the cold spell we had in January, it lasted about 10 days or so, it went up 400%. Now, it's just common sense that it's cheaper to buy a couple of tons of salt and spread it out, put grit bins in the street, than it is to treat all these broken bones. And if you're an elderly person and you break your pelvis and you're 80, that's a life-changing event, just for the price of salt. That's just ridiculous. So we need something done about that. And at the airport, I noticed next week, it's £5 to drop off. £5. It started off at £1. It was for securities, remember? Now it was £2, £3. Last year it was £4. This year it's £5. What will it be next year? Will they just get right up further, or will they? Because we need to start complaining about that. These airports and the airport parking, a lot of them are owned by foreign companies. They should be owned by the Scottish people, and they should be run for the Scottish people, not for the foreign companies. Can't all that money going away? And if somebody goes away on a holiday, you drop them off. It's £5 to drop them off. You go back and pick them up. It's another £5. It's cost you a tenner. If you park in the free bit, which is like a quarter of a mile or half a mile away, with all your suitcases in the horrible weather, if I was going to do that. And so there's a lot of things in this area that need to be addressed, and what you need for that is an independent voice. And I will be an independent voice in the council, because I wouldn't have to keep my head down and defeat the rest of the councillors in my group did. And they're quite happy to sit back and take your votes. One of the things yesterday I had a cracker with a guy who was so shocked that I knocked on his door. He said to me, he had this crazy look on his face. And he says, I was waiting for what he was going to say. I thought he was going to tell me he was a Tory or something. No, he was an SNP voter, and he was so shocked that somebody knocked on his door and says, "I'm going to vote for you because you knocked on my door." Nobody's ever knocked on my door before. The rest of them take it. They're complacent. They take your votes for granted. We didn't do that in Alba. We work for your votes because we are doing it because it's something we believe in. We've got heart. And I think that some of the other folk, they've given up already. Before they've started, they've given up. And I had other things I wanted to say as well, but I'll go on. But I remember the first time I met Alex. That was years and years ago. First time I was a kid, I think you were at a turf show. And I didn't know anything about politics. And then years later, I passed my taxi driving licence. I was a taxi driver. My dad had a company, Abel Taxis in Aberdeen. Some of you might remember, he had a garage as well. And I was the youngest taxi driver in Aberdeen. I was 18. And at one point, I had to go out to Slichen and pick up Alex for his political broadcast. I think he was the only MP in Scotland, maybe at the time. It was for the SNP. And the political slot was 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Who's awake on Scotland at that time of the morning? But so I picked him up at 4 or 5 a.m. Took him into Aberdeen, and he chatted all the way. It was just when they were starting with the speed cameras. And we didn't know where they were. But was it in that lamppost over there? There might be a speed camera. You better slow it down. And then we got to Grampian TV Studios. It's no longer there. And rather than me, I had to wait and return, but rather than leave me waiting in the car, Alex said, "You come in and I'll buy you your breakfast." So he took me in and we had breakfast. And then not only that, when he was doing his bit on the TV, he took me through to the TV studio and I sat next to him. There was a green screen. And so I was just sitting next to him. I was on the TV. He just said, "Be quiet and watch." And they did the interview. And then someone went back in the car and drove them away. Now, any other politician wouldn't have done that. They would have left me sitting out in the car. And I think that's a measure of the great man that Alex is. He's a man of the people. And that's why I follow the Alba Party and I follow his dream of Scottish independence. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Charlie. Can I just say, Charlie inspires me every day to go out and campaign for Scottish independence for the Alba Party, because we worked together in the local council elections, and Charlie worked so hard. He beat the Green candidate, didn't you, Charlie? That's a party that's been going, 30, 40 years. But he did remarkably well. So heart and soul into everything he does, independence first and foremost. Moving on from Charlie, it's my deep honour to introduce Alex Salmond, the leader of the Alba Party. Nobody has ever done anything nearly as much for independence as Alex Salmond. So without waffling on, I'd just like to pass you over to Alex right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Teresa. I hate to disillusion Charlie, but the reason I brought him into Grampian TV Studios early that Sunday morning is I was frightened he'd drive away. I thought to myself, I might not get a taxi back to Stricken at this time in the morning, so I better week him in where I can keep an eye on him. But Charlie's an amazing local candidate. I've had great fun over the last few weeks campaigning around the doors, and he's absolutely brilliant. I mean, quite a few folk have heard him, because Charlie's a talented musician. I mean, and the band Iron Brew. I mean, when I was out camping with Charlie the first time, we're at the exhibition centre, and Charlie says, "I'm playing there next week." See, Rod Stewart was doing a turn at the exhibition centre. So I said, "Are you backing up Rod?" He said, "No, we're at the wedding and marriages exhibition." See, but I heard them last Saturday, and when we had a burn supper in Dundee, and Charlie is an amazingly talented musician, and Iron Brew are a very well thought of local group, and it's the real Iron Brew, incidentally. It's none of this insipid new recipe. This is the real stuff you get when you go listen to Charlie and the band. But it's been a great pleasure, because Charlie talks local politics to people. when he went to the doorstep a couple of weeks ago in that period of Dyce, he didn't sort of say, you know, look, madam, are you voting for independence? He said, these pavements are a bloody disgrace. And they were a disgrace. I mean, we were down by the Don, and went down by the Don, the walkway, the one that goes right to the Buchan walkway, right down to Stratton. And I thought we were coming with their dogs. I tell a lie, the whole family decamped with their dogs, and they had mountain boots on. You know, the soles that stick into the ground, because they couldn't keep their feet, the dogs. And you got this wonderful walkway, and not a gritter bin or salt in sight. You go up to the scheme, no bins, no salt, and the pensioners are frightened to go to their house. Because who'd want to be in a position of going to accident and emergency in Aberdeen at any point over the last few months? You've got a half year toss a coin as to whether you're going to wait 10 hours or 12 hours or perhaps longer. So it might just have been a wee bit sensible, as Charlie pointed out, to have gritter bins on the pavements so that folk didn't fall over and stop the accident and emergencies which were totally unnecessary. In fact, it's not accident and emergency now, it's just emergency. If you've got an accident, you shouldn't go. I don't know where you go, incidentally, these days, but only an emergency, only if you're going to die are you meant to go to accident and emergency. So it's been a great pleasure campaigning with Charlie, because all politics, as he rightly says, is local. So last Saturday afternoon, here's another confession for you, Charlie. I was trying to wangle out the canvassing so that I could go back and see the start of the rugby before we went to the Bunsuffer in Dundee. So you see, when I was limping, Charlie, I was perhaps slightly exaggerating the damage to my leg. You know, I mean, I was, you know, maybe so, but I still thought and admired your canvassing technique. And we're in Bucksburn. This lady comes to the door this Saturday afternoon, man. She's got a coat on, big coat. And I assumed, I said, look, you know, obviously you're just away out. She says, no, I can't afford to be the heating on. Now, wait a minute, just think about this. It's Saturday afternoon, wasn't it a bad day last Saturday? It was cold. Wasn't it a bad day? The sun was shining. And she's sitting on a Saturday afternoon in her house, so cold, in Bucksburn, in the all-energy capital of Europe, and she can't afford to turn on her fire. So she's wearing her big coat, sitting in the house on a Saturday afternoon. Now, I dare say the rugby warmed her up, if she could afford it, but the telly on. So I thought to myself, as Charlie and I were standing in that door, I thought to myself, how shall I persuade this lady that independence for Scotland is a good idea? Shall I, on the one hand, say, madam, the Scottish Government are currently engaged in a constitutional confrontation with Westminster on gender recognition, which clearly is the issue which is uppermost in your mind with your coat on, shivering on a Saturday afternoon in Bucksburn. Or might I say, look, if we control our own resources in Scotland, then the cost of electricity will be as it should be, based on the price of the potential that we have to produce 5 times, 10 times the electricity that we need from green sources. That's why I built the transmission systems from Beaulieu to Denny, so we could cope with that capacity. Or alternatively, should I just say to her, we've got some idea on gender recognition, and that's a big battle with Westminster. So I opted, surprisingly enough, to talk about energy, to talk about the cost of electricity, to talk about the circumstances she were in, and to talk about the scandal of having fuel poverty in a land of energy plenty. You see, I don't mind constitutional battles with Westminster. Indeed, I think it's the job of people who believe in independence and a nationalist government in Scotland, sticking up for Scotland, to have battles with Westminster. But when they're having battles with that lot in London, then you don't know anything about politics. Everything they do is a disaster. Everything they touch crumbles to dust. There is no shortage of things to have battles on. Europe. Why is the health service in disarray? Well, a number of reasons. But one of them is we can't get folk out of the hospitals into care homes because we can't get the staff into the care homes. We can't get the staff into care homes because we've come out of the single market and the care homes can't get the staff. So the Europe is an issue, not just affecting the wider economy, it's also one of the critical reasons while our health service is falling apart. So let's have a battle on that. A constitutional confrontation with Westminster on something that matters to people. Or on the control of Scotland's resources, as I said. The thing that really mattered to the lady with the coat on. Let's explain that to people. And the difference between a country literally shut out in the cold of power and one that has the power to mobilise its own resources. Now, Scotland's a relatively cold country, so is Norway. I'll tell you, I'd rather be cold in Norway because it uses its resources to benefit its people, has done for the last 30, 40 years, while we've allowed Westminster to fritter them away to save the country from solvency. That didn't work too well, and to give billion upon billions, as we see now, to international capital and to the major oil companies. Now, fortunately, because not all countries get a second chance, we've currently got a second chance. And off the shores of Scotland, an array of potential for electricity generation, even greater in total energy terms than the oil and gas revolution, is starting to take shape. We can literally be the green energy powerhouse of the continent of Europe. And if you are that, then of course you should price your own electricity at the marginal cost of production, which means that instead of paying 4,000, which is the real average bill, once the subsidy goes, and believe me, the subsidy will go, you'd be more like 500, 400 or 500. That's what should be happening in Scotland. And people say, oh, well, what's the point in doing that? Well, I'll tell you what the point in doing that is. If you want to see a conversion away from hydrocarbons to usage of green electricity, then price it at its real cost to Scots. Then you'll see that transfer happen double quick. So therefore, that's the sort of issue that we should take Westminster on. And of course people say, oh, what are you going to do with 5 times as much electricity as you need? Well, you sell it, You sell it to our friends down south. Once we get an interconnector across the North Sea, you sell it to them. Or, of course, you bring the industry to the power instead of the power to the industry. You'll be the nirvana for any major power user who wants to have access to cheap, clean, green, renewable electricity. And there are many industries that do. You can base an entire economy in cheap energy. It is the major driver of the economy, as we've seen as it's been driven into the ground over the last year. The energy has and is, and it always will be, I suspect, in its variety of sources, the major driver of any economy. It's the one thing that dictates the cost of production, along with the skills and talents of your people. So I think case for independence should be deployed, and it should be deployed on issues that matter to people. And we should pick battles with Westminster and pick them on ground where the vast majority of the people of Scotland are behind their own government. We should never allow a situation where a group of people in Scotland, the majority women, feel vulnerable because their protected single-sex spaces and medicine and changing rooms, toilets, apparently are under threat. No group in Scotland should look at their parliament and think that is a threat to us. Certainly we should not have a situation where women activists, campaigners, should be looking for the protection of a Westminster government, a Tory government, against their own parliament. That is a ridiculous position to allow to develop, and we should have no more of it. Get back onto the high ground of the issues that matter to people. In 2011, the SNP won an overall majority. I was First Minister. There was one mandate to have a referendum, and we had the referendum. Referendum came along in 2014. We signed with David Cameron the Edinburgh Agreement, like an international treaty, in 2012. And agreed to have it fair and square. People say, oh, well, David Cameron was kind of pushover. Really? Cameron was a giant in comparison with the last, how many is it, 4 prime ministers? No, Cameron wasn't going to try and deny a referendum, but listen, he would have fixed the referendum if he possibly could. Maybe he did, who knows? But he would have done. He would have had a 50% rule. He wanted 2 referendums, not 1 referendum. He wanted to control the franchise. You think he would allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in their country's future? So all these things had to be negotiated, and to make Westminster agree to your democratic demands, they have to know you're going to do something. If they don't agree, you're not going to say, oh, well, that's really bad. I'll ask again in 6 months. You have to be prepared to do something, to mobilise the political power that you have, to bend them to your will. And in particular, back in the day, David Cameron knew that and I made sure he knew, if he hadn't agreed to the referendum between us, then I was going to hold our own referendum in Scotland. Now, I wouldn't have had it head on, because that likely would have been struck down by the courts. So I'd have had a referendum about Scotland's right to decide on independence, which would be within providence, within legality. And I would have put it through the Parliament, so as if it was struck down by the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court would have been in a position of having to strike down an Act of Parliament, which many courts, most courts, even this one, are loath to do. And that was a much more favourable court than the one we have now. Now, why on earth the Scottish Government went to the Supreme Court last year and asked you, what do you think about Scottish independence? You think we've got the right to have a referendum? Now, Lord Reid, trusty Scots Tory that he is he going to say, oh yes, I think after due deliberation, me and my colleagues, we think you've got the right to have a referendum to break up the country of the United Kingdom, of which we are the Supreme Court? Is that altogether likely? Because in politics, in life, you're best not to ask a question unless you know the answer. And if you're going to ask a question, then put that court in a position of having to face down the majority will of the Scottish people through an act of its Parliament. So what should happen now where we are, because we can't just rest behind the old Irish story, where I go now, well, I wouldn't have got here in the first place, I wouldn't have started from here. You can't do that. We are where we are. Now we're told there's going to be a de facto referendum through an election. Well, if you're having a de facto referendum, don't have it in Westminster. You're playing a game away from home. There's no way any Westminster election is going to be dominated by the sole issue of Scottish independence, because it'll be about who's going to be the next Prime Minister. And that's what the 95% of the media will be about. If you're having a de facto referendum, you have it in a Scottish election. Why the Westminster one? A Scottish election. Which is much better, incidentally, because there's 2 votes in the Scottish election, one on the constituencies and one on the list, which means you can get a majority of seats on the constituencies and a majority on the list, which is what happened in 2021. And Alba was just formed. But the relatively small vote that Alba got on the list was enough to take the list vote for independence over 50%. So when would you have it? Would you wait to 2026? Well, I wouldn't. Because the lady in Bucksburn, she wasn't in any mood to shiver in her house for the next 3 years. It's a kind of urgency. The people waiting in A&E, I don't want to wait 3 years, although they might have to for an operation just now. There's a solution to the health service. The businesses which are losing out as a result of removal from the single market, they don't want to wait 3 years. What do I do now? Now, luckily, one of the few benefits we got from the process in 2014 is that the Scots Parliament can amend the Scotland Act. And the bits of the Scotland Act it can amend are the bits that says how the Parliament calls an election. As you may remember, before the Supreme Court intervened, we were promised a referendum for October the 19th this year. So my suggestion is that the Scots Parliament amends the Scotland Act and arranges to have the election for October the 19th this year by deciding by majority in the Parliament to dissolve the Parliament and have the election this year on the single issue of Scotland being an independent nation and the Scots' right of self-determination. And people say to me, right, okay, what about the Supreme Court? And struck down that? Well, I'll tell you they wouldn't. Because Lord Reid may be a crusty old Tory, but he's not a fool. And the idea of a court, a London court, striking down an act of the Scottish Parliament where a majority of that Parliament say, let's have an election and let the people decide, would put you directly in conflict with popular will, and they won't do that. Westminster, of course, the Tory government of Westminster on its last legs. It's may have no seats at all. I met a friend of mine the other day, and he said he was going to be he was planning his shadow cabinet in London. He reckons there'll be 30 Tories left, so he's planning his shadow cabinet, so he's going to make a bid for the leadership. He's only going to need about 10 folk to support him. So, a Tory government at its last legs, yes, they could pass an act overruling the Scots Parliament, again putting them in direct conflict with the popular will of Scotland. So bring it on! Let it happen! If that's the route to go down. But that would be redeeming a promise made to the Scottish people of having a date with destiny, a vote on our independence on October the 19th this year. That clean up the act. Get away from the self-identification. Get on to self-determination. Get on to the issues that matter to people. Two things led to this from the success of the SNP over the last 30 years. One is we realised that if we wanted to win, we had to link the constitutional issue of independence to the social and economic issues facing the people, the practical things, like the lady shivering in Bucksburn. And the second thing we realised is every group in society must not fear independence, must see they would have a part in the new country, the new independent country we're trying to build. 30 years ago, believe it or not, I know it sounds daft now, but 30 years ago, lots of Catholics in Scotland thought an independent Scotland would be some sort of Northern Irish Protestant state. And it took a lot of work to convince people that wasn't the case. That everybody would have a place, regardless of religion and belief, in an independent Scotland. And of course, it worked so well that a majority of Catholics voted for independence in 2014. A generation ago, Asian Scots needed to be assured that they would have a place in the new Scotland, and that worked superbly well as well. And I see some Asians in the front, I should say Kashmiri, Mr. Majid, in the front row. If the vote in 2014, the franchise had been restricted to Asian Scots, we would currently be an independent country. They voted overwhelmingly for independence. So no group, whether it be people of religion or Asian or colour or women, should feel threatened by the constitutional move to independence. You can't, the business community in Scotland, you go back 30 or 40 years, they thought the independence was totally pursued by romantics with no head for business, no idea that you should work for a living and have a fair return on your efforts. That had to be done. We had to demonstrate we could run the shop, we could run the show in the Scots Parliament before people would trust us to move to independence. And that's why independence went from 25% to 45% in the referendum, 50% at one point during the referendum campaign. That's why it stands at 50% now, and that's why you must not, under any circumstances, allow a position where that is frittered away by foolishness, by not thinking through the strategy. You have to work for independence every single day. And when the chance and the choice comes, as it will, because you'll need all of these groups in society behind your campaign. Now, this is a meeting about the Wee Alba book, which we produced last year. We've done 100,000 of them. These are some of the very, very last copies. I think there's 120,000 were reprints of the 120,000. So make sure you take yours home again. Because the next edition, when we produce it, I'm pleased to say we'll have bigger type. It'll still be a wee book. But some of the thoughts in this are about the preparations for independence. About how do you prepare? Because, I learned lessons from 2014. You have to have every single avenue covered, every single argument covered. And, the world has changed a bit since 2014, and not for the better. And therefore, the case for independence has to be updated with it. I'll give you just one example from many in this book, which is a conversational, common sense way to look at how this country can mobilise its resources through independence for the betterment of its people. And that is the question of Europe. Now, I read the other day that the latest position of the SNP is if we vote for independence, we'll vote to go back into Europe. Well, the problem with that, and it's perfectly true, and of course Europe is a huge issue, as I previously said, because Scotland got dragged out of the single market, dragged out of Europe against their will. But there are lots of Scots who believe in independence who are not enthusiasts for the European Union. And therefore, to say to people like, we're taking this decision, which means another decision, it's not right. You'd have to allow people the right to decide. I mean, we didn't vote for Brexit, but Brexit happened. We're now no longer in the European Union. And we'd have to negotiate our way back in, and that would mean a deal. And that deal would have to be put to the people of Scotland. Of course it would. And why on earth do you want to alienate people who might be strong believers in independence but less convinced about the European Union? Why would you do that? That's daft, it's stupid, it's silly, and it's totally unnecessary.
But can Scotland survive out of Europe?
Yeah, well, I'm coming to that exactly now. There's another very practical argument. To negotiate your way back into the European Union will take a minimum of 5 years. Michel Barnier, if you remember Michel Barnier, he was the negotiator for Europe against or with the UK, and he was a lot better briefed than any of the UK politicians. That was blatantly obvious. Now, as you know, Michel Barnier is a Scotophile. He loves Scotland, right? He loves whiskey, he loves bagpipes, he thinks it's the most beautiful country in Europe. Comes here on his holidays, for all I know. I don't know that for a fact, but I know the other bits. If we were negotiating with Michel Barnier, his love of Scotland wouldn't make quite a difference. He'd be there negotiating for the best interests of the European Commission and the Council of Ministers. And it would take 5 years to get back in. Now, I want you to picture a scene where, what's your name?
Fiona.
Fiona, you're First Minister of Scotland, right? And you're sitting looking over a table at whoever is Prime Minister of the UK in a year's time, after we had a de facto referendum on October the 19th this year. Now, you're Prime Minister of Scotland, First Minister of Scotland, Fiona. We don't know who's going to be Prime Minister of the UK. It could be anyone. It could be Starmer. Let's say it's Keir Starmer. And Keir Starmer looks at you, Fiona, and says, listen, we're just wondering about what your trade policy is going to be. What are you going to do about trade? And you say to him, well, we're very keen on getting back to the European Union in 5 years' time. And he says, what about 5 days' time? 5 months' time? So, that's a problem. That's a problem we didn't have in 2014, but we have now. So you've got two options. You can either say, if we'd only voted in 2014. Or alternatively, you can say, is there another option? And luckily for us, there is another option. It's called EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. And the most important thing about EFTA, as far as this argument is concerned, as far as your negotiation with Keir Starmer is, and incidentally, I think you'd win with Keir Starmer. I'm telling you, I mean, I watch him. You take him to the cleaners, Fiona.
You're right.
Absolutely.
You're bang on the money.
I know. Well, EFTA, what's EFTA? Well, EFTA is 4 countries: Norway, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and Iceland. Now, EFTA is not a bad place to be. Well, I'll tell you why it's not a bad place to be. Each of these 4 countries is in the top 10 in the world in wealth per head. Now, getting into EFTA doesn't guarantee you top 10, but obviously it's not a bad place to be if all of EFTA are in the top 10. And people say, well, because they've got good resources. I mean, Norway has oil and gas. I mean, if only we had oil and gas. Iceland has fishing. Oh, if only we had fishing. Switzerland has a large financial sector. Oh, if only Scotland had a large financial sector. We've got all of these things that all these countries have. So I don't think we'd do any worse than any of the 4. I think we'd be in the top 10. It might not be immediate, take time, but we get there. But EFTA takes you not 5 years to get in. It takes you 3 months. If that, actually, between meetings. And I've been to every EFTA country and to EFTA in Switzerland just to check this out, and the answer is yes, and it's all in the Wee Alba book. So obviously, you would join EFTA. What EFTA gets you? Well, it gets you access to the EFTA treaties, it gets you a route into the single market through the agreement with the EFTA agreement with the European Union, and it eases the transition. But most of all, Fiona, it means that just in case there was a slight chance of that Keir Starmer getting the better of you, you wouldn't have a single chance when you're able to smile at him and go, we're going for EFTA, what's your policy? So, that's an example of how things have to be updated and how we can clear the economics of Europe. And then, at some point, you can look at the politics. Maybe Scotland would like to go back into the European Union. But in economic terms, you can secure the position, because the economics is about access to the marketplace. It's about free movement of labour. You secure that, and you're cooking with gas in your negotiations. So that's why we produced the Wee Alba book. There's a number of issues just like that in this book. Well worth a read if you've got a handy magnifying glass to read this edition. Or you can go online and make it bigger. And the next edition, I promise you, will still be a Wee Alba book, but will have that bigger type. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been delighted to do what I can to campaign for Charlie. This guy is a first-class candidate. He would be an outstanding asset to Dyce, Bucksburn and Danestone if he's elected. The Aberdeen Council has not been a byword for effective representation over these last years. And he would certainly be a counterbalance on some of the nonsense. I mean, he listed some of the things in the town centre. I mean, couldn't say, unless you're a charity shop, you can't afford to be in the town centre of Aberdeen because of the rates in the town centre. I mean, it's bloody obvious. It's totally obvious what you need to do. I was furious at Christmas. I used to go, when Lindsay's built the pantomime, I went to the His Majesty's every year for the pantomime, right? But one thing I liked doing was driving through and getting the lights. You can't do that anymore. You can't see, you can see the Christmas lights. That's something you want to show off, you know. It's something you want to attract people in to a vibrant town centre. So Charlie's got some cracking ideas, as well as some common sense ideas for this community. He would be a great representative for Dyce and Bucksburn and Danestone, and I strongly commend you to vote Charlie Abel number 1. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. A stirring speech, as always. I hope you learned a lot from that, everybody. We're moving on now to questions. I've got some written questions first, and then we'll put it over to the floor. Most people wanted me to read them out, but the very first one is, it says, do you wish that the chair ask the question? And he's written, no, I'll do it. So Dave, are you there to ask your question? It's for Alex and Charlie.
Yes, Charlie and Alec both highly regarded by family. There's a number of questions that any members of family from the 50s, my daughter, to my parents' generation, aunts and uncles that are still alive. One question that they have is that's a broader context from we discussed tonight already, and that is that if an SNP candidate and an Alba candidate are competitively posed in any election, right? The concern for my family is that, for better or worse, SNP at the moment, we're all it's 53, 54, 59, and that's the figures that we've set a lot of store on over the past few years. So I guess the bottom line is the concern is that this would be further assailed upon in terms of the gaining the majority if there's two parties competing for the same thing.
Okay.
And of course the difference of loyalties for everybody will happen.
Of course there are. And I can well understand that. I think why I think it's a good thing to have a number of independence parties. Let's take the current issue. The issue is dominated, in my view, very foolishly the last few weeks, the gender recognition debate. A lot of people in Scotland, that's a very big issue. I mean, it wasn't a month ago, incidentally. But unfortunately, the Parliament's made it an issue with the coincidence of Ireland Bryson and the various things. And of course, now every tabloid will make it an issue. That's dreadful for transgender people, incidentally, because every single issue is going to be seized on by the tabloids. And transgender people will now be associated with criminality. It's dreadful. But that's where, unfortunately, look, I introduced equal marriage in Scotland. I'm proud to do it because it was the right thing to do. But I didn't make a constitutional confrontation out of it, or wish to have a constitutional confrontation, because there are some issues you're best not to have. I mean, I wouldn't, what? Equal marriage. Well, if there's a conscience issue, I was confident most folk would support it in the Parliament, most folk did. And I also talked it through, I had endless discussions with the churches and various folk, and if we could find an amendment that helped them along, then we passed the amendment because the idea was the principle of equality. And you know, very few people, not everybody obviously, but very few people now would say that was a bad thing to do. That hasn't been how the transgender debate has been handled at all. There was amendments from 9 SNP folk, which could have been accepted, and if they'd been accepted, it would have avoided the current controversy and drawn the sting from the debate. That would have been a good idea. But the point I was going to make to you is this is where we are now. For the folk, let's say the folk who think that's a big issue, a really big issue. Women's rights are threatened, women's safe spaces, protected sex spaces are threatened under the Equality Act. What are they to do now? You know, we don't want them, we can't vote for the Greens. I mean, the Greens have been very quiet over the last week or so in this instead, but they're the driving force behind this. We don't want to vote for the Greens because they won't do that. We don't want to vote for unionist parties. We don't vote Tory. So it's quite a good idea to have an independence party that takes a different view. And now let's think about the elections that we face. This is a local election, Charlie Stanley. You get to vote 1, 2, 3. So you can vote for Charlie, number 1. And if Charlie doesn't get elected, I think he will, but if he doesn't, then your second preference goes to the SNP and they get a vote. So you get 2 votes for the price of 1. So next thing, let's think of a Scottish Parliament election, where you have the constituency vote and the list vote. The constituency vote determines the number of seats. Remember Nicola Sturgeon has said we're going to have not just a majority of seats, but a majority of votes. So the constituency vote, the first vote determines the constituency, the number of MSPs elected. The second vote, the list vote, it will have 2 things, determines the number of votes for independence. The parties are not in competition with each other, they add. And also, if Alba gets a decent vote, you'll have far more. You know, if Alba had a third of the SNP's second votes in the election of 2001, you wouldn't have, whatever it is, 70 or so independence MSPs in that parliament, it'd be 100. So actually, the political system we got is actually complementary to having more than one independence party, particularly an independence party which takes a different view. And the last thing I say about Alba is this. When I joined the SNP, the idea of the Scottish Parliament was a pipe dream. The SNP had had some success in the 70s, but nothing had been achieved. The Assembly wasn't got. Folk didn't think it was going to happen. The SNP, when I stood in Banff-and-Buchan in 1987, had got 11% of the vote in the previous election, not in Banff-and-Buchan, but across the country. So we were kind of far away from... But then a group of us in the 1990s realised, look, the SNP at that stage were important, obviously, to keep the flame of independence burning, but we also knew that any time we rose in the polls or had any sign of increased support, the Labour Party, the dominant party in Scotland, as dominant as the SNP are now, suddenly rediscovered that all these years ago they'd actually been in favour of the Scottish Parliament. Kind of went to the shelves and dusted down, you know, what they'd done years before. And as they saw the SNP got successful, they went, oh my God, we're going to get into a constitutional convention, you know, we'll promise a referendum. And the referendum arrived in 1997, and the rest is history. In our words, I see the role of Alba towards the SNP rather like the role of the SNP towards the Labour Party back in the 1990s. As soon as Alba moves ahead and starts to register some votes, you'll see the SNP focus again on what it should have always been focusing on, is how you get independence. Not how you get mandate after mandate and do nothing with it, but how you actually get independence. Because any political party, when they see their political base eroding, moves to protect their political base. Just like the Labour Party did back then, so will it be with the SNP and Alba now. I'll just let the gentleman have a follow-up, and then I'll come to you, Fiona.
Briefly, so if a magical figure like 58% popularity in an election is shared by, say, 40% Alba and 60% SNP, is that going to be as effective to drive things through? Or will it just be like, I can't play with a ball of twine and rest and stuff? That's
Well, the answer is yes, because remember, Nicola Sturgeon set a high bar for the de facto plebiscite election. She said it needs a majority of seats and the majority of votes. So for the majority of seats, the vast majority of them will be SNP. For the majority of votes, Alba will make a contribution to get us over that 50%. I would say once you've got that, you have to find a way to enforce it. It doesn't solve the problem, but it gives you a much stronger political position to address the problem. Fiona.
Is it not a bit like the Grand Old Duke of York? You march all the people up to independence and you march them all back down again. And you march them all up and you march them all back down. And I'm speaking relative to the SNP. If Nicola truly wanted independence, and I don't believe she does, why would she be making life so difficult? Why would she divert everyone's attention to gender recognition, which we really, I mean, I have nothing against these people, whoever you want to be, but that's not important in the country at the moment. Get independence. So I don't believe that she really wants independence. I don't believe that she's a nationalist. Not anymore, but I used to. I was in the SNP. I was convener for Southern Branch, and I only lasted 6 months because I didn't like what I saw. I don't believe what comes out of her mouth anymore. She's not for independence. Only Alba is. Only Alba stands up and says, this is for the people of Scotland. They used to be SNP, so what went wrong? That's my question.
Okay. Let's take it a wee bit away from personalities, and I'll tell you what I think. And I've had, listen, I know you just said it, and you've articulated it very well. As you might imagine, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And thinking about, you see, back in the day, back when I was a young firebrand, instead of a slightly older firebrand, which is what I'm doing, in the SNP, right? I was always having fights, you know, I'm talking about political fights, arguments, debates. Because, you know, the SNP was the greatest debating society in Scotland, I'll tell you, the 80s and 90s. What a place for having debates. It was marvellous, brilliant. And debates, and I got impatient with folk like Gordon Wilson, and Jim Fairley, not the Jim Fairleys in the Parliament, but it's fairer, and myself and folk like Professor Neil McCormack and Jim Sillars. We put forward a different view, right? And our view was, look, let's get hold of the Parliament, and once you've got the Parliament, use that as a bridgehead towards independence. Their view was often, well, we should just go straight to independence. But I felt they never quite defined how they were going to do that, you see. Now, that was a fierce argument. In many national conferences, it was a big, big debate. But I never doubted for a second, not for 1 second, did I doubt Gordon Wilson's commitment to independence. On the contrary, he spent his life campaigning for it. He wanted it, or Jim Fairley's, or any of the other people, Jerry Fisher, who used to articulate that view which I disagreed with. Because the SNP, nobody in the SNP in the 80s or 90s was a careerist. For the very simple reason, there was no careers. I mean, you could not be a careerist in the Scottish National Party when it had 3 or 4 MPs. I mean, chances of getting to be one were pretty insignificant. And perhaps, as you know, our hopes were realised, and the party became more and more successful, and became the dominant party of Scotland. Perhaps, and I'll put this at its mildest, the SNP attracted to its ranks people who weren't particularly interested in the destination of independence, were much more interested in the power and influence of the SNP as a party of government in Scotland. I think we attracted in careerists. And the SNP now has hundreds of people. I'm not talking about the MSPs and MPs, I'm talking about their staff and clients, you know. Hundreds and hundreds of folk who are entirely dependent on the party's success. And maybe not so enthused by the independence vision, which was the party's raison d'etre. Because I can tell you, the party back then, we never stood for the prevarication, procrastination, inaction of the last 8 years. Not in a single second. So I kind of blame myself, because I should have seen it. And I didn't see it. I just had the comfortable assumption, as you sometimes do through life, you know, you think things are as they were. And my vision of the SNP was that party I was proud to be part of in that period. Not because I expected overwhelming success or even to be an MP, but just I knew that every single person in it was absolutely 100%, 110% committed to independence. I think the SNP fell victim to careerism. And when I look at, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's some outstanding MPs in the SNP, Joanna Cherry, for example, Angus McNeill. They're outstanding members of Parliament in any of these terms. And in the Scottish Parliament, I listened to Fergus Ewing on the way up today, and Fergus was reading some common sense into the Parliament about the bottle return scheme, which is going to be a disaster. Ask any small business involved in it. It's going to be an absolute disaster. And Fergus was giving it loudly, you know. I was so impressed, I thought to myself, give him a ring. But I didn't have his new number, so I've got it now. I'll give him a ring tomorrow and tell him how impressed I was. So there's good MSPs, there's good MPs, but there's also people, frankly. I wouldn't invite to dinner if they were paying.
It's going to be difficult for people to decide, I want independence, so I have to vote SNP to get it. Or am I going to take the risk and vote Alba and maybe not get the independence that we're desperate for?
That's what I was trying to debate a minute ago. In this election, let's talk about this election, there's no risk. Because you can vote for Charlie 1, SNP 2. But neither is there in a Scottish election. Because if that's what you want to do, you can vote the SNP in the constituency, get majority of seats, and vote Alba, which will count to the majority of votes. And remember, even weeks, days after this party started in 2021, rather, it was the Alba vote that took the independence vote over 50% on the list. It was the Alba contribution, if you add together the SNP, the Greens and Alba, took it over 50%, just over 50%. So a Scottish election or a local election, there's no debate. In a Westminster parliamentary election, it depends where you were. If you're in Kirkcaldy, I'd vote for Neil Hanby. Why? Because he's an excellent member of Parliament. And listen, I don't know how many of you saw Neil's bill. We're talking about what the SNP should be doing just now. Well, there was an example in Parliament in the 10-minute rule bill last week, where we got a profound, a superb, substantial outlining of the case for Scottish independence that Neil Hanby delivered in the Westminster Parliament. Speaking truth to power. Now that doesn't get you independence, but that's the sort of thing that inspires people, because it was about the fundamental rights and democracy of the Scottish nation, as well as paving a route for how you would do it. That's what the SNP should be doing, and unfortunately, some people are convinced that their job in life is to be the shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, or the shadow Minister of State for the Treasury, or the shadow something, or to chair a select committee of the House of Commons. Get real. And in Westminster, I was in Westminster for 25 years, right? I know the place like the back of my hand. It's one of the advantages I had in the negotiations for the referendum. If you know your opponent, you've got an advantage. Unfortunately, Nicola, lots of folk in the Scottish Parliament have no real idea about Westminster. But there's also a danger in Westminster. You can get sucked in. And better groups of MPs than the SNP, with the Clydesiders, the Independent Labour Party, and they got sucked into the Westminster system. A long time ago, I had an interview with Andrew Marr, and I'd stopped Nigel Lawson's budget with the poll tax, right? And so Andrew Marr, who's a young journalist at the time, making his way, came and interviewed me, see? The thing he was interested in, this is what he made his article on. These days, there used to be a bell, still is, sounds in the Commons for a vote. And I was doing an interview with him in the Pewsing room. The bell sounded, I didn't look at the screen. It's a reflex action. I remember, what's the vote about? I didn't bother looking at the screen because I was talking to him about independence. And he made the point of that, if you're caught in a system, and it's a small point, but it's an important point. If you think the rota is to, get the 5 stars for good attendance in the Westminster Parliament, you don't understand your job as a nationalist member of Parliament. Your job is to make life so uncomfortable for people who deny Scots their right to decide their own future, is that eventually they'll say, I can't stand this anymore, let's give them the chance, let's get rid of them. That's your job. Your job is to look at the institutions of the state and to launch a democratic attack on them. Your job is, as Neil and Kerry did in the last day of Boris Johnson, was to stop the proceedings. People say, what good did that do? Yeah, that's 2 MPs. And the Speaker almost had apoplex, incidentally. I feared for that man. But listen, what happens if that happens every day? Not one day, but every day. It telegraphed me that single incident went round the world in publicity terms. I say it happens every day, and people say, why is the Westminster Parliament being brought to a halt every single day? What is going on that this should happen? Why should people, MPs, want to do that? Well, the answer is because their fundamental democratic rights are being denied. It's a peaceful, a civilised, it's an entirely legitimate way to progress your country. Now, of course, you pick and choose. No point in disrupting it when there's nobody there. You take the state occasions, the opening of parliaments, the budgets, finance bills, when a Prime Minister is leaving, which happens about every 3 months. That's what you do if you're serious, and you combine that with popular agitation and action around the country, you combine it with mass mobilisation of people, you combine it with diplomatic initiatives. I spoke in Rennes in the École Nationale a few weeks back. I mean, I'm entranced by the case. They want to hear about it. Oh, for goodness sake, let's tell them. So I think we've got the means, we've got the mechanism. I think ALPA is an absolutely essential part of it. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting here in 8 years' time and naught will have happened. I'll be shorter.
Next question is from Irene. This one's for Alex. It said, Rishi Sunak said yesterday that Ukraine should bear arms to defend their independence and democracy. Does that mean we in Scotland should do the same, since this government is not giving us our democratic rights? And isn't that hypocritical?
Well, it's certainly hypocritical, but that's not the route that Scotland should take. The national movement, through its history, its democratic history, when we've had the opportunity to vote, has been a peaceful movement. We should continue in that vein. That's how we should progress our case. That doesn't mean you should be weak about it. You should be strong about it. You should use the institutions where we have a majority to challenge the institutions where we don't. You should use your MPs and MSPs to advocate the case for independence. You should use popular will. Should use diplomatic initiatives, should embarrass the Westminster government into concession, each and all of these things. But the national movement in Scotland has always been heralded as a constitutional movement, and so it should be. That's a distinguishing feature. Incidentally, the case I make internationally on that is that I point out to people, it'd be really nice, you know, if the good guys and girls were to win. You know, the folk who play by the rules, who look at a constitutional case for independence, who, you know, in 100 years of people striving for self-government, a parliament for Scotland for independence, the worst the Ernie's had is a nosebleed. Or an egg in the back, if Jim Murphy, if indeed he didn't put it there himself, he's a half doubt, but it doesn't matter. But it's nothing, you know. Very, very few movements, political movements of any kind, can say that. It's something we should carry with pride. That's the right thing for us, and that's the right way for us.
Next question. I think we'll put this one to Charlie. The one thing I see a lot of on social media is the friction between SNP and Alba. Wouldn't this be better off for the cause to work with each other in order to achieve the main objective, independence? P.S. I would really like an Alba sign for the window.
Hi, Callum. That's right. I agree with you. And we've got a sign for your window. That wouldn't be a problem. Yeah, we should not be fighting on social media. This is not a football game, and the tribalism really has to kind of stop. We've got to work towards the common goal of independence, and fighting amongst each other gets us nowhere. We need to be unified, and we need two parties to be able to win a proper election in Holyrood, to get a massive supermajority that was offered back in 2021 and was rejected by the SNP leadership. But I think the SNP members are becoming more and more educated as time goes on, and they'll see that Alba is not the enemy, Alba is your friend. And I see a lot of the stuff on the social media. Some of it's been directed to me as well lately. I just ignore it because it's not a rabbit hole I want to go down. And because you'll just both get dirty.
Thank you, Charlie. The next question is from Carol. How can we reverse the institutional policy capture of our government and public institutions? As we have recently seen with the Scottish Prison Service, this has resulted in them acting ahead of, and in many cases in breach of, the law. Maybe one for Alex here.
It's interesting. Some of that will be in reversal, but it's true. There's a institutional capture. I mean, Aberdeen Council, the questionnaire for 7-year-olds asking children 7 years old, what gender do you associate with? I mean, come on. And the answer, I mean, when that appeared in the paper, the council official, unnamed, was quoted as saying, yes, we've detected a great deal of gender questioning among our primary schools. Have you? No, I mean, I know it's every day. Look, there's so many issues in the schools of Aberdeen. That ain't one of them. So this capturing, we've got to do the thing we think's politically correct, we've got to get advance of the times, we want to get 5 stars from Stonewall. It's a problem. It's a real problem. The 5 stars you want is for running a health service, for running an education system, for building A9. That's the 5 stars you want. And, I hope and believe that as time goes on and Alpa becomes more influential, that perhaps we'll get the institutional capture and decaptivate some of it, to get people to think sensibly, rationally. Obviously, social attitudes change and move. Of course they do, and that's a good thing. But the idea that unelected officials can, scream in advance of legislation is just not on and shouldn't be allowed. If they want to do that, then they should stand for election.
Next question is from Fiona. Is it? I'm trying to read. Anyway, it's for Alex. Margot MacDonald, 2013, believed MI5 had infiltrated the SNP. What steps will Alba take to ensure this is not the case by the time of Indie Ref 2?
Well, in terms of Alba, I don't actually think MI5 is the issue here. Although, it's ridiculous not to believe that there would be some security services influence, probably not in the parties as much as in some of the officials in Scotland, which I think is an open question. But the way to do it, I think careerism is much, much more of an issue. People who regard their, they get into a position where the position is everything as opposed to the aim and objective they had. This is not a new phenomenon for a political party. But I think it's happened to the SNP, it happened to the Labour Party a long time ago. And you get brief reversals when the Labour membership say, no, we don't want that. And then, of course, the pressure. Jeremy Corbyn, for example. Now, I don't think Jeremy was an ideal political leader. I've known him for God knows how many years. I like him. He's a principled guy. I don't believe for a second he's an anti-Semite and stuff like that. But, the establishment have banged down upon him and, to make him unelectable and all the rest of it. So you'll get a lot of that. But the key for Alpa and the key for the national movement is to get our eyes back on the prize and remembering that what our objective is. And of course, if you don't allow yourself to be diverted, it ceases to be an issue. So when you allow yourself to be diverted and turned into knots, that becomes a problem. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the day that Alpa becomes successful enough to infiltrate.
The next question is from Angus, and it's for Alex. Ooh. I noticed Jim Sillars and Alex Neil contributed to the Wee Alba book. So he'd like your opinion, or Alex's opinion. Number 1, Jim Sillars financially donating to Labour's Jackie Baillie, arch-unionist in brackets, at the last Scottish elections. Number 2, Alex Neil's forward to SNP Stuart MacDonald's paper published yesterday, where Indie Ref was kicked further into the long grass. Both actions disgraceful for the right to re-establish Scotland's independence. So what do you have to say about that, Alex?
Well, neither Alec or Jim's an Alpa member. Jim's an SNP member, so's Alec. But firstly, I never took the attitude when I led the SNP for 20 years that I expected everybody in the SNP to toe the line. It's ridiculous. Well, where do you think this leads, saying every single person will agree with you on every single thing? I mean, independence was quite important to me. I didn't want to be not believing in independence, but I had as many votes as I possibly could as conscience votes. I pushed the vote out in conscience votes because people, it's not a great idea to degoon people. If you can't persuade them, it's not a great idea to say, we'll take the whip away, or we'll remove your privileges, or we'll demote you from the front bench. It's not the way to run a political party. The discipline that matters is self-discipline. The SNP were an incredibly disciplined party, not in the 90s, incidentally, when I became leader at first, in a bit of fraction, but in the period of the Parliament, 2007 to 2000, well, actually from when I became leader again in 2004 to I stood down 10 years later, 2014. It was probably the most disciplined party that's ever been seen. And I'll tell you why. That discipline was more than anything else a result of being in the trenches, particularly in that first Parliament where we were a minority government. We had a plurality of one. Everybody stuck together like we did in the trenches because they were under enemy fire all the time. And it was a self-discipline that mattered. And I believe in self-discipline. I don't agree. I think that Stuart McDonald is a waste of space, if you're asking my honest opinion. I'm delighted to find out that apparently the Russian security service think he's important enough to get his emails. Really? But anyway, but I think his arguments in the Constitution are just silly. What is his argument in that pamphlet? I haven't read it, I have to say. I've just looked at the national account of it. But the argument seems to be, we shouldn't have a de facto referendum now, because that wouldn't work. But he might be right about the Westminster aspect of that. I don't think it would work. But he doesn't say, let's have it at Holyrood. He says, no, let's just do the same as we've done for the last 4 elections. But this time, for the 5th time, it'll work. The definition of madness is when you do the same thing and it doesn't work. I mean, if you're trying to address that, you would say, let's do it this time and let's have popular demonstrations, which folk like Stuart McDonald don't really like. Let's have parliamentary intervention, which folk like Stuart McDonald didn't really like. I mean, he's really miffed that he's no longer the shadow defence spokesperson. I think it's a silly idea. But if I were the leader of the SNP now, would I say you don't have the right to express it? No. And I'm certainly not going to tell Alec Neil whose forward he writes for what. I mean, Alec did a very good piece on pensions for the Wee Alba book. And I was delighted he did so, because it's something Alec knows a great deal about. I think he's got... And Jim did something on EFTA, because he was one of the first people to see the advantage and the possibility that EFTA offered Scotland. And Jim's got a fine mind. Now, if Jim wants as an individual to give money to Jackie Bailey, then that's not what I would do. I can promise you I've never given a penny to any unionist party in my life, nor will I. But that's a matter for Jim. And if somebody's got talent, like Jim has and always has had, and has a magnificent oratorical style and a great strategic mind, and he says, look, I'm prepared to do an interview for the Wee Alba book, fine. But none of these people are in Alba. But even if they were in Alba, am I going to sort of lose any sleep if somebody disagrees with the party line? No. What matters is what the party says, what it decides to do as an organisation and how it articulates the message. And trust me, the very least of anything that worries people about Alba just now is to say, well, on page 26 we have this your QR code. I should have mentioned that actually. I'm glad the question came up. The QR codes. If you don't know what they are, then ask your kids or your grandkids. They'll tell you how to do it, and you see it all, and it's all great. So let's don't worry about that. Let's worry about getting the profile that we need to be successful. Alba, believe me, in this local by-election, Alba has enormous potential vote. An enormous potential vote. 20, 30 more percent or more. The only thing that's stopping folk is they're not convinced that Alba's strong enough. And the way to convince them is to canvass more doors. Now, we're making progress. I know we're making progress because, back 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago now, who's Alba? No idea, basically. Right? Last year, don't know. This year, people want to know. A lot of people know who it is. A lot more want to know what it is. Not really want to know, as was said earlier by Charlie. You stand up on their doorstep and you're past the first base. Because they say, well, he's on the doorstep. Where's our candidates? So, it's old-fashioned, it's important. Go round the doors, identify the support, and on election day, bring out the support. And I promise you, as soon as Alba starts to register a significant vote, you'll see everyone else jump to the independence tune.
Our last written question is from Mary, and it's for Alex. Alex, do you ever wonder what the situation re-independence would be if you had continued as First Minister?
Mary, where are you? Mary? Oh, Mary. If ifs and ands were pots and pans. You know, that's that. I've had this. A number of people have asked me this question effectively. Do you regret, etc., etc.? And all I can say is I thought it was the right thing to do back in September the 19th, 2014. I thought it was the right thing for the movement. I thought, you know, just go over that and you'll get a surge. In Scotland's tombstone, will be inscribed the words, "It's no fair." Right? It's no fair. We've been done doing. Nothing Scotland loves more than supporting something, an idea that's been done doing. And hence the response, you know, after September 2014. Buyer's regret, I think they call it. And I thought that was the best thing to shove things forward. I also thought it might be a hung parliament in Westminster. And it would have been if Ed Miliband hadn't been such a tube. And, you know, thinking about the kind of experience I had, I thought, you know, hung parliament can be a great thing if you hold the balance of power. You can hold the balance and hold the power. But it can be an awful thing, as the Liberal Democrats find out, if you don't know how to do it. And, you know, due modesty and all that, I knew how to do it. But it didn't happen, so that, you know, I thought that might be the theatre where we shove things forward. And incidentally, I don't think the non-action between 2015 2016, the non-action starts when the Brexit referendum happens. That's when the first of a number of big opportunities arises. You know, you have to either secure Scotland's position, as Northern Ireland did, against its own will, or majority will, within the single marketplace to make things easier for a transition to independence, or alternatively, mobilise for the independence campaign and mean it. And don't mean just send a letter to Theresa May so she can say, no, it's not the time. I mean, really mean it. You know, present a political threat. Say, if you don't do it like I would have done with Cameron, we'll have our own referendum. And then you'll see a different attitude. Because the last thing a British Prime Minister would do is say, oh, we'll just let the Scots go off and have their own referendum. And that in itself is an act of independence. So, the answer, Mary, is that for years and years I used to say, oh, now I've started to say, you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Are there any final questions from the audience before we move on to the raffle and the auction?
Can I ask just one?
Yeah.
I read a thing today about the fact that the Scottish census was a year late and hasn't yet been published or the information released. Rumour, and you all know more than this than I do, is that it's because it's so damning about the number of English immigrants that have moved up to Scotland since 2014. And if that be the case, that surely will have a massive effect on any vote for independence.
Okay. Can I answer that question, and then I'm going to ask Charlie if you'll sum up for the local issues and your points in the campaign, which are so good. I always take the view that you play. I learned to play golf. My father took up golf in his 40s. He was an absolute golf fanatic. And the one thing he drummed into me was when I went into the rough and I was tempted to get a kick when he wasn't looking, he'd look over his shoulder and say, play the ball as it lies. So my attitude to politics is you play the ball as it lies. We can't do anything about the electoral register in Scotland. We have in my view, correctly, a civic ballot. People who stay here The Scottish Parliament one is even more civic, incidentally. You know, it includes European nationals, for example, and rightly so in my view. So, the people who live and work in Scotland are entitled to vote, regardless of where they come from, and that is how it must be. Yes, of course, changing demography, demographics can be a challenge. Of course they can. Then we have to rise to that challenge. All I would say to you is, as the changing demographics have gone on, the support for independence has increased. And, you know, we've gone from the 20% to the 50%. If we'd been playing the ball right in the present moment, it would be 60%. I think it can be overcome, and you just have. And you know, what did I try and do about this? Well, I had groups like Asian Scots for Independence, where succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. Alba has a group, African Scots for Alba, which has lots and lots of members. We had New Scots, which was an organisation basically founded by people who had moved to Scotland from England. And these are some of the most enthusiastic campaigners. Abdul Majid, who was kind enough to give me a run up from Glasgow to make this meeting, his greatest friend in life and my greatest friend in life was Bashir Ahmed, who was the first Asian member of the Scots Parliament. And I remember Bashir coming with Asian Scots for Independence back in 1995 to the Perth Conference, and he made a stunning speech. And the word and phrase he used, he says, look, I've come to join a party that's not interested in where I come from, but where we're going together. And that's my attitude to the civic issues and the electorate that we have. We play the ball as it lies. The independence case for Scotland is overwhelming. All we have to do is to argue it, not get ourselves caught up in the wilderness of other issues, but argue and articulate it, and find a way to enforce the democratic mandate of our people, all our people. Charles.
Aye, well, independence, it starts everywhere on a local basis. And I give you a wee example of what you could be doing if you were an independent country. In Luxembourg, it's one of the smallest countries in Europe. I was there in December, and I was amazed. I felt like a homeless person walking about there because everybody was better dressed than me. I'm quite well dressed tonight, but my normal clothes when I'm playing and touring, it's just normal clothes. But I felt like I was from a third world country in a way, and all the people were well dressed, the buildings were beautiful, the place was clean. I didn't see many people that didn't look like they were short of a few bob, and they had free public transport. Free public transport. I mean, you see the price of a bus in Aberdeen? If we were independent, why can we not have free public transport? And I was in Iceland a couple of years earlier. Iceland's got free public transport, and it's got free heating and free electricity. Like, people don't pay bills there, as far as I can. And we're in the energy capital of Europe. Iceland, I think it's less than 300,000 folk. So it's about a population of Aberdeen, Biden, and a massive island. And it's all spread about. And it takes ages to get around about Iceland, and it's hell of a terrain. There's volcanoes and everything. There's glaciers. We're in a city. We've got all that oil and all that wind sitting on our doorstep, and we can't afford to heat a house. I mean, that is it. That's it in a nutshell. And if you still can't see a case for independence there, and you can't see a reason to vote Alba in a council election, to get Alba in there, to push the SNP, to move towards independence, and you have to look deep inside yourselves. Where's my case for the union? Because there is no one. It's a simple case of right and wrong now. That's what I would say. Has anybody got any other questions?
Question for Alex. Will he keep his taxi meter on when you were back that day?
Well, that was my worry, you see. I believed, and I've got to give fair dues. If he got his sausages and his scrambled egg and an extra portion of beans, then that would be square, and it was, and it's been square ever since.
Moving on from the point you were making there, Charlie, about the free public transport, I think we need to bring that into the bigger discussion about things like the Scottish pound and how having our own currency allows us the flexibility to introduce these policies. You then have to counter the argument about, if you're going to go into the EU, you have to adopt the euro. I hear that all the time, and that's one of the things we need to be able to answer. Now, that's a fallacy. It's a classic that a European sort of yes minister speak, if you like. You have to express an intent to enter the euro, but there's no compunction. The way you go into the euro is you have to spend a minimum of 2 years in the exchange rate mechanism and abide by their rules. And this is the get out. There's no compunction to join the exchange rate mechanism. So as long as we express the intention at some indeterminate point to go down the euro route, that's all that's required if we decide to go into the EU. But I think you're right, EFTA is definitely.
I'm just going to say, you've been reading the Wee Alba book. It's a very good explanation. Well, quite you probably expressed it more succinctly as it is in the book, but that's exactly what is in the book. You expressed it very well. Complication, obviously, is if you tried to have, as the SNP are now saying, a bridging sterlingisation, you would have the EU having to accept you being in a currency which was out with the European Union, and I think that'd be problematic. So all routes now, and it will be a different case 2014. 2014, our major trading partner was part of the European Union with us. So therefore that was a big argument for not having another currency in the EU. Now, to me, there's no argument. You get your own currency as quickly as you possibly can. And as you rightly say, all the EFTA countries, well, Liechtenstein has a currency union with Switzerland, but Iceland has its own currency, as Charlie just told us, with a few 100,000 folk. Norway has its own currency, Switzerland has its own. Of course, you would have your own currency. It's an advantage. The EU, you've described it correctly, but it would be a point of negotiation, let's put it that way. The Unionists deliberately misconstrue it, but again, to avoid that totally, then Alba's for EFTA. Okay.
Well, everybody get your raffle tickets out, and we'll put Rob and Mary over there on the raffle. Rob will be the runaround. Rob, you can draw out the first. If Mary holds up the first prize, Rob can pull out. That was extremely exciting and well done. Is it Scott, isn't it? Yes. So I'd like to ask Alex and Charlie for their final remarks, just a few minutes each. Who wants to go first?
Right, well, I've done lots of the Alpha book meetings around the country. This is number how many?
50.
50, so 100. But it's been a great pleasure, and it's really good to combine it and have Charlie speaking as well. So I'm hoping, obviously we're just starting to think it's a wee bit what's in the book, but getting 120,000 of these books out in the country is quite significant actually. That's something in 1 year. We're going for the next edition after our spring conference in Inverness, and we'll be doing probably the same again, and probably growing a wee bit more, hopefully in the build-up, and further advice on the de facto referendum for the COVID-19 is accepted. It's going to be an exciting year. But whatever happens, we'll continue to bring forward the ideas to keep the independence movement on the high ground with the pursuit of national freedom. That's what we are for.
Folks, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves this evening, and I hope you're going to vote Alba number 1 in this election for me and for the Alba party. And when you go away here tonight, I hope you take the messages that you've learned and you speak to other people in the community, you get involved in politics. One of the big things you find when you're knocking on doors is sometimes people are not interested in say things like you're all the same. It doesn't make a difference who I vote for. I'm only voting this time. I've had that time and time again so far. And I tell them that I understand where you're coming from. And that's why I'm here, and that's why Alba are here. And unless you get out and you vote, nothing will change. And if you keep voting for the same parties, nothing will change. So get some breath of fresh air into politics and make sure you vote Alba at every opportunity, and let's get ourselves independent and a
a free country again.
And finally, Callum, please don't leave without your sign. Come and speak to Charlie. And I've just been delighted you all came along tonight. And Aberdeen Alba are so delighted to have such a fantastic candidate in Charlie. And the wonderful Alex Salmond come to see us. So I'd just love to give a wee present from Aberdeen.
Anyone from the side, I'm very happy to do it now.